Gopi Janavalabha Giridharadhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Giridhari Radha Giridhari Radha Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astatara Sata Shri Srimad Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astatara Sata Shri Srimad Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Granthara Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Nitai Gaura Premananda Hari Hari Bol. Namo Vishnu Pinay Krishna Jai. Bhutani Shrimati Devi Nitasam Nitanamani Bachari Prabhadaksham Chabat. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're continuing the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 31, the movements of the living entities, text 45 and 46. Dravyopalapti stanasya Dravyeksha yogyata yada Tat panchatvam mahammanad Utpatir dravya darshanam Dravyopalapti stanasya Dravyeksha yogyata yada Tat panchatvam ahammanad Utpatir dravya darshanam Dravyopalapti stanasya Dravyeksha yogyata yada Tat panchatvam mahammanad Utpatir dravya darshanam Dravyopalapti stanasya Dravyeksha yogyata yada Tat panchatvam mahammanad Utpatir dravya darshanam Dravyopalapti stanasya Dravyeksho yakata yata. Tat panchatvam mahammanat. Utpatir dravya darshanam. And 46, they're together. I'll just chant the 46 and then we can do word for both verses. Yatakshno dravya yavaya darshana yogyata yada tadaiva chakshusho drashtur drashtrit vayogyatayano. So word for word. Dravya, of objects. Upalabdhi, of perception. Stanasya, of the place. Dravya, of objects. Iksha, of perception. Ayogyata, incapability. Yada, when. Tat, that. Panchatvam, death. Aham manat, from the misconception of I. Utpati, birth. Dravya, the physical body. Darshanam, viewing. Yata, just as. Akshna, of the eyes. Dravya, of objects. Avyaya, parts. Darshana, of seeing. Ayogyata, incapability. Yada, when. Tada, then. Eva, indeed. Chakshusha, of the sense of sight. Drastu, of the seer. Drastritva, of the faculty of seeing. Ayogyata, incapability. Anayo, of both of these. Translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation. When the eyes lose their power to see colour or form due to morbid affliction of the optic nerve, the sense of sight becomes deadened. The living entity, who is the seer of both the eyes and the sight, loses his power of vision. In the same way, when the physical body, the place where perception of objects occurs, is rendered incapable of perceiving, that is known as death. When one begins to view the physical body as one's very self, that is called birth. Purport. When one says, I see, this means he sees with his eyes or with his spectacles. He sees with the instrument of sight. If the instrument of sight is broken or becomes diseased or incapable of acting, then he, as the seer, also ceases to act. Similarly, in this material body, at the present moment, the living soul is acting. And when the material body, due to its incapability to function, ceases, he also ceases to perform his reactionary activities. When one's instrument of action is broken and cannot function, that is called death. Again, when one gets a new instrument for action, that is called birth. This process of birth and death is going on at every moment by constant bodily change. The final change is called death, and acceptance of a new body is called birth. That is the solution to the question of birth and death. Actually, the living entity has no birth or death, but is eternal, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, Nahanyate hanyamane sharire. The living entity never dies, even after the death or annihilation of this material body. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. We're coming to the conclusion of this very fascinating chapter in the Srimad Bhagavatam, where Lord Kapila Dev has taken us so far from birth, actually pre-birth, yes, conception within the womb, the living entity's situation within the womb, and then the living entity's situation coming out from the womb and being enveloped by the illusory energy. And then he describes what is that main bondage of illusion, and that is relationship and attraction between male and female. So we've been through those verses. And Lord Kapila Dev is explaining very clearly just how this is the knot that binds us in the material world. This is the illusion. And now he's continuing his explanations and taking us up to death, this process of death. And as we hear in today's verse, there's process of death, process of birth. As soon as we view the physical body as ourself, that is birth. So this process of death is there, and this process of birth is there. And today's verse is just a very practical explanation. What is this process of death? And as Lord Kapila Dev says, it's very similar to when you can't see anymore. And when your eyes, you have some problem, they're incapable of functioning. This incapability, we read again and again in the Sanskrit. So it's just like that. When the body is incapable, then it's no good for the self anymore, and it's cast off. It's a very practical way of looking at death. Yes, when it is no longer functional, then it's no longer inhabited, and that change is called death. And even though we can approach death in such a practical way, still that's a very challenging thing to do. Actually just realize the practicality of the situation, that it's simply a change. As Yudhisthira Maharaj says in the Mahabharata, when he is being asked those questions, what is the most wonderful thing? And his response is, the most wonderful thing is that all around we see others dying, but we think it won't happen to me. We don't see it's going to happen to us. And this is the role, Bhagavatam, of the saintly person, as we hear from Lord Kapila Dev here, is opening our eyes to the reality of the situation. I remember being in a situation where I had this response also from my spiritual master. I was with a very close friend, the first devotee I ever met actually, when he left his body. I was with him and his wife. And I wrote to my Guru Maharaj also knew this devotee. I wrote to my Guru Maharaj when he left, and my Guru Maharaj's response, he wrote back, "Don't think this won't happen to you, don't waste your life." And that is the role of the saintly person, yes, that they remind us of this reality that in our material world everyone tries to cover. We hide away old people in old people's homes so we don't see them so much. We don't see the suffering of old age and death. We try to turn our face away from that reality. And yet when you're faced with that reality, in this situation where I was with Prabhu and his wife, for the last 2 weeks of his life he had the most aggressive form of brain tumor that there is. And throughout his illness I would travel to help them, spend time with them. They had such a big influence on my life. And for the last few weeks I was there with him and his wife, helping to nurse him. And I could see how this is such a transition. The transition that the body has to go through. Of course, depending, different times death is a quick process. Sometimes death is a more drawn out process. This was quite a drawn out process. And to see the situation of the body, what the body has to go through in a challenging death situation, as from cancer, from tumours like that. It was a very challenging situation for his body. And yet I could see, for him as a devotee, what was he attached to? The final thing he was able to do, because he went through so many different phases of losing his power of speech, losing the ability to move, and when he was simply able to lay and not move at all, not speak, not even open his eyes, the final thing that he moved was his hand. And we always had his beads just in his hand. And if the beads would ever drop out of his hand, you'd see his hand just move around to hold his beads. He was unable to chant at that stage, but that was his attachment, and I could see that. And we were constantly reading for him or chanting kirtan. And even though it was such a transition, I could see that he was steady. Even in such a challenging physical situation, he was steady. And I was very grateful to be there and go through that experience with him, as he had given me so much in my Krishna consciousness. And then to be there at that time in his life. He was a young man. I'm almost the age that he was when he left. And I remember that moment, the moment when the soul left the body. You can just tell. There is an instant difference. It's incredible to see, actually. And when I saw this, at that moment, I realized the truth. And this is our ABCs of spirit difference between a dead body and a living body. It's the presence of the spirit soul. When the spirit soul leaves the body, you can see immediately that different body. So that was a very intense. I'm very grateful for that experience. I was able to be there with Prabhu. And going through these verses, whenever I hit verses about death, I always recall this experience. And especially, that it will happen to us, as my Guru Maharaj reminded me very powerfully when I was right in that situation. Don't think it won't happen to you. Don't waste your life. Because we can easily waste our life just running around trying to enjoy in so many ways, or even just being so busy, being so occupied that we don't contemplate death. But what is the Srimad Bhagavatam? This we're hearing is being spoken to Maharaj Parikshit when he's about to die. He's contemplating the end of his life. This is a constant reality for us. We hear again and again through the Shastra instances of great devotees. What do they do? What do we do at the time of death? This is what we should also. That time of death, nobody is immune at all. It's going to happen to us. When our body is no longer functional, we will cast it off. And that transition is going to be challenging or less challenging depending on our consciousness, depending on our attachments. How attached are we to our body? Are we ready to say goodbye? Are we ready to say goodbye to the body? And not have to enter into another physical body, not have to enter into another material body. Are we preparing for that? And how do we prepare for that? What a transition. We prepare for that by developing our attachment to Krishna. That's how we prepare for death. So that at that time of death, as Maharaj Parikshit's desire, at the time of death, I will think of Krishna and go back to Golok Vrindavan. And this is what Srila Prabhupada has given us, again and again and again. Back to Godhead, go back to Godhead. We see in Srila Prabhupada's own examples. We just had his wonderful disappearance festival on Thursday. Yes? Prabhupada showed us how to leave the body. And that's a very pertinent lesson. It's something we're all going to have to face. But it's something that easily is very much at the back of the mind, if it's there even at all, you know, as we go about our life, as our bodies are healthy. And yet it can come at any time. But because, as Lord Kapila Dev has been describing in this chapter, as soon as the living entity comes out of the womb, it's covered by the illusory energy. And that illusory energy is so strong. That illusory energy helps us to feel very attached to our body, helps us to identify with the body. So to cut through that illusory energy, we need to develop our attachment to Krishna. See what is the reality by studying the Shastra, following the examples of the saintly persons, and engaging in all of our processes of devotional service. When I was thinking of this, I was thinking actually, one of the real keys, and we find this in Shastra, for developing attachment to Krishna is developing attachment for Krishna's devotees. Excuse me. When we feel attached to Krishna's devotees, then our relationship with Krishna becomes very strengthened. Because devotees are attached to Krishna. When we become attached to the devotees, we naturally become more attached to Krishna, and Krishna becomes very pleased. Because what is Krishna's favorite thing? Krishna's devotees. So if we can develop attachment for Krishna's devotees, a service attitude toward Krishna's devotees, really putting ourselves out to serve the devotees, then our attachment to Krishna becomes very strong, becomes very real. And that should always be at the forefront of our devotional life. How can I serve Krishna's devotees? And we should be ready also. Be ready in any circumstance to serve the devotees. When we are more able to, or even when we're not so able to, or even in a challenging situation like illness and leaving the body, you know, we would hope that when we're leaving, who's going to be there for us? We want the devotees to be there for us. Yes. So then we should be willing to be there for others, to assist in that transition. And Krishna will put us in these situations where we can gain that realization of just how important it is to develop our attachment to him and develop our attachment to his devotees. Because it is whatever we're attached to, that's what we're going to be left with at the time of death. If we're attached to our body, we're going to be left with this very difficult transition. Because the more we're attached to our body, the more we're going to feel the pain of separation from the body. The more we're attached to Krishna, we'll be fix our to be able to, just as a Vrindavan, well maybe not a residents of Vrindavan, but following in their footsteps, how they always cry out to Krishna in their times of excuse me, I have something tickling in my throat. How they raise their hands and cry out, Krishna help us, Krishna save us, even when Krishna is just a little boy. Krishna save us from Indra. Save us from the rain. Krishna save us from the forest fire. These terrible situations, and yet they're crying out to his form as a little boy. Simply because of their attachment to him, their dependency on him. So these are the qualities that as devotees, we follow in the footsteps of residents of Vrindavan to try to attain these qualities of dependence on Krishna, calling out to Krishna, allowing ourselves to feel helpless. I think only Krishna can save me. And when we when we are developing our attachment to Krishna, that's easy. We call out to Krishna when we feel attached to him. Because the residents of Vrindavan are supremely attached to Krishna, that's who they cry out for all the time. They don't think of crying out for anyone else. Well, thank you so much, Prabhu. So in the same way, to go through this whole transition of death is going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot from us. But when we are attached to Krishna, we can fix our consciousness on Krishna, feel dependent on Krishna. And then this transition, while we will go through the physical experience of death, the devotee's consciousness can be completely somewhere else. Even though the physical body has to go through that change, then the spirit soul is having a very different experience. And we're going to see this happening more and more and more. As we see in our community, as devotees age, we're hearing quite often now about the passing of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, the older devotees. You know, we're actually, as a community, we're going through this experience. And that will just only increase. Yes? And yet we can experience as a community and individually with dependency on the attachment